Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Han mansion, casting golden rectangles across the marble floors that Yuna had polished until they gleamed like mirrors. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the climate control system and the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the east wing. The rest of the family wouldn't stir for another 2 hours. That was by design. Yuna's stepmother believed that help should never be seen or heard until the family was ready to grace the world with their presence, and Yuna had learned long ago that arguing with that particular piece of cruelty was futile. Yuna had been awake since 4:30 that morning, as she had been every morning for the past 5 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She kept count because counting was the only thing that made the endless repetition bearable. Her hands moved mechanically through the motions, preparing the elaborate breakfast spread that her stepmother demanded, laying out the formal dining settings with the precision of a military operation, organizing the laundry room so that every towel was folded at perfect right angles, checking the inventory of the wine cellar to ensure nothing had been touched by unauthorized hands. She worked without complaint because complaint had long since proven useless. She worked without tears because she'd cried them all in the first year, alone in her tiny servants' quarters while the rest of the family slept in the lavish bedrooms upstairs. She worked without hope because hope had been systematically stripped from her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the routine. Her father had built this empire from nothing, a humble start in a tiny office with a single desk and a dream that had grown into one of the most successful conglomerates in South Korea. And now the woman he'd married after Yuna's mother died had turned every stone of it against his only child. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Yuna wasn't the help. She was the daughter of the man whose name was still on the deed, whose portrait still hung in the master's study, whose legacy was still whispered about in the boardrooms of competitors who had tried and failed to topple his empire. But after his sudden death from a massive heart attack 3 years ago, all of that had stopped mattering. The will had been conveniently lost in a filing accident that no one could explain. The lawyers had been conveniently unavailable 4 months, and by the time Yuna had managed to track them down, they had already been handsomely paid off by her stepmother. And Yuna, still grieving and barely 19, had been too shattered to fight. By the time she found her voice again, she was already wearing the uniform of a servant in her own home, scrubbing floors that her father had once walked across with pride. Her stepmother, Myri, had made sure of that with surgical precision. "You're not an omega worth keeping," Myri had told her coldly on the day of the funeral, her alpha pheromones flooding the room with aggressive dominance. "Your father made a mistake marking you as his heir. You're weak. You're submissive. You'll never run this company, and you'll never amount to anything. The best thing you can do is learn to be useful in other ways. Learn to clean. Learn to cook. Learn to serve. It's the only future someone like you can hope for." Yuna had wanted to scream. She had wanted to remind Myri that she was still a Han, that her blood carried the same alpha lineage as her father's, that her designation as an omega didn't erase her heritage or her right to inherit what was rightfully hers. She had wanted to fight, to claw, to tear down the carefully constructed lies that Myri had built around her. But the words had died in her throat like ash. Because Myri was right about one thing, Yuna had presented as an omega, not an alpha, and in their world, in their family, in their cutthroat society, that made her less than nothing. An omega was property. An omega was a commodity. An omega was something to be bought and sold and traded like currency. And Yuna had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Now, at 24, Yuna had learned to swallow her pride with every meal she served and every floor she scrubbed. She had learned to bow her head and lower her gaze and make herself small. She had learned to disappear into the shadows of the mansion that had once been her home, becoming invisible to the family that had once loved her. But she hadn't learned to stop dreaming. Every night, when she collapsed onto her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, she closed her eyes and imagined a different life. A life where her father was still alive, still smiling, still calling her his precious daughter. A life where she had presented as an alpha and claimed her birthright. A life where she was free. And every morning, she woke up to the same reality. She paused by the window in the east wing, her fingers instinctively moving to the worn photograph tucked inside her apron pocket. Her father's face smiled up at her, warm, kind, full of the love that had been her only shelter in childhood. She traced the outline of his jaw with her thumb, remembering the way his stubble used to scratch her cheek when he kissed her goodnight. "I wish you were here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wish you could see what they've done to me. I wish you could see how far I've fallen. I wish you could tell me what to do, because I don't know how much longer I can keep going." The photograph was the only thing she had left of him. The only thing that Myri hadn't been able to take from her. She had hidden it in her apron pocket for 3 years, pulling it out whenever she needed a reminder that she had once been loved, that she had once been valued, that she had once been someone's entire world. She remembered the day it had been taken. Her 18th birthday, the last good day of her life. Her father had thrown her a lavish party despite her protests. She'd never been comfortable in the spotlight, and she'd told him as much. But he'd insisted, his alpha presence warm and protective. "You're my only daughter," he'd said, ruffling her hair the way he used to when she was a child. "You deserve the world. And I'm going to give it to you, even if I have to fight the entire universe to do it." She could still feel the weight of his embrace, the steady rhythm of his alpha pheromones wrapping around her like a shield against all the darkness in the world. She could still hear his laughter, deep and genuine, echoing through the halls of the mansion. She could still see the pride in his eyes when he looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in the universe. 3 months later, he was gone. And everything fell apart. "Yuna." The sharp voice cut through her reverie like a blade. She flinched instinctively, shoving the photograph back into her pocket as she turned toward the sound. Her stepmother stood at the top of the staircase, dressed in a silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed even at this early hour. Her alpha scent filled the hallway, expensive, aggressive, designed to dominate every omega in her vicinity. It was the scent of a woman who had clawed her way to the top and would do anything to stay there. "Yes, ma'am?" Yuna answered instinctively, lowering her gaze. She had learned the hard way that direct eye contact with an alpha was a challenge, and she had no desire to provoke her stepmother's wrath before breakfast. Myri descended the stairs with the grace of a predator. Her heels clicked against the marble, each step a measured beat of authority. "There's someone at the gate. Let them in." Yuna frowned, her brow furrowing with confusion. "At this hour, ma'am? The staff doesn't start." "Did I ask for your opinion?" Myri's eyes narrowed, her pheromones spiking with irritation. "Just do as you're told. I don't pay you to ask questions. I pay you to obey." Yuna's stomach twisted with a familiar mix of anger and resignation. She wanted to argue. She wanted to remind Myri that she didn't get paid at all, that she worked for room and board like a medieval servant, that her labor was worth more than the scraps she was given. But she knew from bitter experience that arguing was useless. Myri didn't care about logic or fairness or the truth. Myri cared about power, and she had all of it. "Yes, ma'am," Yuna said, her voice flat. "Right away, ma'am." She moved toward the front entrance, her footsteps silent against the marble. Her mind was racing, trying to figure out what this was about. Visitors at dawn were unusual. Most of Myri's social circle didn't wake before noon, and business associates knew better than to interrupt her morning routine. Whoever this was, They must have been important enough for Myri to summon her before her coffee. The iron gates creaked open as she approached, and her breath caught in her throat at the sight of the woman standing on the other side. She was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, powerful build that spoke of physical labor and hardship. Her clothes were worn and patched, threadbare in places, with the kind of wear that came from years of use and not enough money to replace them. Her boots were scuffed to the point of disintegration, held together by what looked like sheer determination. Her hair was tangled and dark, falling across a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so tired. There were deep shadows under her eyes, and her scent, faint, barely detectable, carried the unmistakable undertones of an alpha who had been through hell and was still fighting to get out. But there was something about her that made Yuna stop short. Something in the way she held herself, even in those rags. Like a soldier who'd forgotten how to lower her guard. Like a queen who'd been exiled and was biding her time until she could reclaim her throne. Her posture was straight, her shoulders back, her chin lifted in a way that suggested she wasn't used to bowing to anyone. "Can I help you?" Yuna asked, her voice cautious. The woman's eyes, deep, dark brown, unreadable, flickered over Yuna's face. For a moment, something sparked in them. Recognition? Surprise? Curiosity? It was hard to tell, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared. But for that brief instant, Yuna felt like the woman was seeing her, really seeing her, in a way that no one had in years. "Myri Han is expecting me," the woman said. Her voice was low, rough, like she hadn't spoken in days, but there was a quiet authority in it that didn't match her appearance. Yuna wanted to ask more questions. She wanted to know who this woman was, why she was here, what she wanted with Myri, why her presence made Yuna's omega instincts prickle with a strange mixture of unease and something else, something almost like curiosity. But her stepmother's command rang in her ears, and she knew better than to disobey. "Follow me," she said quietly, stepping aside. She led the woman through the gardens and into the mansion's main foyer, her mind racing with possibilities. The woman followed silently, her footsteps surprisingly light for someone of her build. Her scent grew slightly stronger as they walked, and Yuna caught notes of something familiar in it, something that stirred memories she couldn't quite place. Who was this woman? Why was Myri meeting with her at dawn? And why did her presence make Yuna's omega instincts scream with a warning she couldn't quite interpret? Myri was waiting in the living room, her posture regal as she sat on the couch that had once been Yuna's father's favorite. She was fully dressed now, in an expensive cream-colored suit, her hair swept up in an elegant bun, her makeup flawless. She looked like she was about to close a billion-dollar deal, not meet with a homeless stranger. She didn't stand when the woman entered. She simply watched, her cold eyes assessing the woman's tattered appearance with barely concealed contempt. Her alpha pheromones filled the room with subtle aggression, a clear attempt to establish dominance over someone she clearly viewed as inferior. "This is the girl?" the stranger asked. Her gaze settled on Yuna again, and this time there was something different in it. Something almost like sadness. Like she was looking at someone who had been broken and was trying to figure out how to put them back together. Myri smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just won a game she'd been playing for a long time. "Yes. This is the Omega I told you about." Yuna's blood went cold. A chill ran down her spine, settling in her stomach like a stone. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Quiet," Myri snapped. She stood and walked toward the stranger, her heels clicking against the marble. "She's healthy. Good breeding stock, if that's what you're into. She can cook, she can clean, she can do whatever you need her to do. I'm practically giving her away at this price." You'll be getting a bargain, and I'll be getting rid of a problem. The stranger's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in her cheek. I didn't come here for a servant. I came because you said you had something to offer me. Something worth my time. And I do. Myri's smile widened, showing teeth. $100. That's all I'm asking. Take her, and she's yours. Do with her whatever you want. Sell her, keep her, use her, I don't care. Just get her out of my sight. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Yuna felt the world tilt sideways. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, and she had to grab onto the back of a chair to steady herself. No, she breathed. You can't be serious. You can't do this. This isn't legal. This isn't. Myri glanced at her with open disdain. I've been feeding you and clothing you and housing you for 3 years, Yuna. I've let you live in this house despite the fact that you're useless to me, despite the fact that you're nothing but a drain on my resources. I think I've been more than generous. More than patient. More than kind. And now I'm finally getting rid of the burden you've been. Generous? Yuna's voice cracked, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. You've treated me like a slave. You've made me work from dawn to dusk without pay. You've taken everything my father left me and told me I was worthless. Because that's what you are. Myri's eyes flashed with alpha dominance, and Yuna felt her omega instincts force her gaze downward. Her body betrayed her, her submission instinct kicking in despite every shred of her while screaming to fight back. You're an omega. You have no family, no money, no future. The best you can hope for is to find someone who will tolerate you. This woman is willing to do that. You should be grateful. The stranger stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You're truly selling her? For $100? That's less than the cost of a decent meal in this city. Does it look like I'm joking? Myri laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a cold, cruel sound that made Yuna's skin crawl. I've seen the way you've been sleeping in alleys, scavenging for scraps. You need someone to take care of you, and she needs someone to own her. It's a perfect arrangement. A match made in heaven, if you believe in that sort of thing. Own me? Yuna's voice rose, desperation bleeding through. I'm not property. I'm not a thing to be bought and sold. My father would never have allowed this. He would. Your father is dead, Myri said flatly. And I'm in charge now. You should have learned that lesson a long time ago. The stranger reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Her hands were steady as she counted out $100 in crumpled bills and laid them on the glass coffee table. The money looked pathetic, a sad little pile that was worth less than the rug Yuna's father had imported from Persia. I'll take her, she said quietly. Yuna's heart stopped. She felt like she'd been punched in the chest, like all the air had been sucked out of the room. No, she whispered, backing away. No, I won't go. You can't make me. I'll call the police. Who do you think they'll believe? Mary's smile was razor-sharp. A respected alpha businesswoman with connections all over Seoul, or a worthless omega who's been living off my charity for years. You have nothing, Yuna. No money, no power, no proof of anything. You're a nobody. And nobodies don't win against people like me. Yuna's hands were shaking. Her entire body was shaking. The world was spinning, and she couldn't catch her breath. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. She was going to wake up any second, back in her narrow cot, and none of this would be real. But it was real. And it was happening. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Myri grabbed her wrist, her grip bruising. Go pack your things. I had the staff put them together already. Everything you own is in a bag by the back door. I want you out of my house in 5 minutes, and if you're not gone by then, I'll have security throw you out. And believe me, Yuna, they won't be gentle. Yuna's eyes filled with tears, hot and stinging. Please, she begged, hating herself for the weakness in her voice. Please don't do this. I'll work harder. I'll do anything. I'll be invisible. I'll never speak again. Just please don't. Enough. Myri's voice was ice. I'm done listening to your pathetic begging. You're a burden, Yuna. You've always been a burden. Your father was a fool to leave you anything, and the only mistake I made was not getting rid of you sooner. Now get out of my sight. Somewhere in the hallway, Yuna heard the unmistakable sound of laughter. Her stepsister, Su-young, emerged from the shadows, her phone in her hand, filming everything with a vicious grin. She was dressed in designer loungewear, her hair perfectly styled even at this hour, her omega scent dripping with false sweetness. This is going to be so viral, Su-young said, her voice dripping with malice. Look at you. The Great Han Omega, sold for $100 to a homeless woman who smells like garbage. Your father would be so proud. He always said you were special. And look at you now, special enough to be worth less than my shoes. Something inside Yuna broke. She looked at Myri, at Su-young, at the cold, empty mansion that had once been her home. She looked at the portrait of her father that still hung in the study, his warm eyes watching her with a love she'd never felt from anyone else. And then she looked at the stranger, the woman who had just bought her for less than the cost of a decent meal. There was no kindness in that woman's face. But there was no cruelty either. Just a quiet, steady resolve that made Yuna pause. Just a flicker of something in those dark eyes that felt almost like sympathy. I'll wait by the gate, the stranger said. You have 5 minutes. If you're not there, I'll assume you've decided to stay. But honestly? I don't think you should stay. I think you deserve better than this. She turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing through the silent mansion. Yuna didn't pack. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't take anything except the bag that had been left for her by the back door. She didn't look back at the house that had been her prison for 3 years. She simply walked to the back door, picked up the small bag that contained the only belongings she had left in the world, and walked out of the Han mansion without looking back. The morning breeze hit her face as she stepped past the gates, and it was the first time in years she felt like she could breathe. The stranger was waiting for her by the curb. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Yuna's hands were trembling, her omega instincts screaming at her to run, to hide, to find somewhere safe. But there was nowhere to go. There was no one to save her. The only person who had ever loved her was dead, and the people who were supposed to protect her had sold her like livestock. Why, she finally asked, her voice barely audible. Why did you buy me? You had enough money to survive for weeks. You could have bought food, clothes, a place to stay. Why waste it on a stranger? The woman was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline. Then, without meeting Yuna's eyes, she said, because you needed somewhere to go. Yuna blinked. What? I saw the way she was treating you. I saw your face when she said you had nothing. I've been where you are, Yuna. I know what it's like to have no one. I know what it's like to feel like the whole world has abandoned you. No one should have to live like that. No one deserves to be treated like that. Yuna stared at her, completely lost. Nothing about this woman made sense. Her clothes were worn, her face was haggard, and she smelled like she hadn't bathed in a week. She was an alpha, yes, but she was clearly homeless, clearly desperate, clearly at the bottom of the social hierarchy. There was absolutely no reason for her to help anyone, least of all a stranger. Yet she had spent her last $100 on a complete stranger. "Why do you care about me?" Yuna asked. "You don't even know me. I could be dangerous. I could be a con artist. I could be." The woman finally met her gaze. "Maybe I wanted to know someone who didn't see an alpha when they looked at me. Maybe I wanted to find someone who didn't care about what I could give them. Maybe I just wanted." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't know. It doesn't matter. You need help, and I can help you. That's all." There was something in those words. Something that made Yuna's Omega instinct stir with unexpected warmth. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. "I'm Cha Yuna," Yuna said quietly. "Though I don't know if that name means anything anymore." The woman smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it transformed her face from weary to kind. The kind of kindness that came from someone who had seen the worst of the world and decided to be better anyway. "I'm Kong Sua," she said. "And right now, that name means everything that you're still willing to say it." The stranger's name was Kong Sua. That was the only thing Yuna knew about her as she followed the taller woman through the winding streets of Seoul's older districts. The neighborhoods grew shabbier as they walked, the shiny glass towers of Gangnam giving way to aging buildings with rusted balconies and faded laundry lines. The streets narrowed, the sidewalks cracked, and the smell of exhaust fumes gradually gave way to the smell of cooking oil and stale air. Sua led her to a narrow alley tucked between two crumbling apartment blocks. The alley was dark, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and the walls on either side were covered in graffiti and ancient posters. At the end of the alley stood a tiny house, barely bigger than a garden shed, with a rusted gate that groaned when pushed open. "This is it," Sua said, stepping aside. Yuna peered inside. The courtyard was small but clean, with a few worn chairs arranged around a cracked stone table. There was an old bicycle leaning against the wall, its wheels flat, and a stack of neatly folded blankets on a wooden shelf. A few potted plants sat in the corner, their leaves drooping with neglect. It was humble. It was modest. It was nothing like the mansion she'd grown up in. But it was safe. And it was real. "It's not much," Sua continued. "But it's safe. And it's mine. Well, it's rented, technically. But I've been here for 3 years, and the landlord hasn't kicked me out yet, so I'm counting it as a win." Yuna stepped through the gate, her bag clutched to her chest like a lifeline. "You live here? By yourself?" "For now." Sua's expression was unreadable. "You can stay as long as you want. Or you can leave. I won't stop you. I won't force you to stay. This isn't a prison. You're not a prisoner." Yuna stared at her. "You bought me. For $100. And you're just letting me go? Just like that?" "I didn't buy you to keep you prisoner, Yuna." Sua's voice was gentle. "I bought you because you needed help. That's all. You're free to do whatever you want. Go wherever you want. I won't stop you. I won't come after you." But freedom meant nothing when Yuna had nowhere left to go. She looked at the tiny house, at the quiet courtyard, at the alpha who had shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than her own family had in 5 years. She thought about the mansion she'd left behind, the family that had betrayed her, the life that had been stolen from her. She thought about her father, and what he would have wanted for her. And she made a decision. "I'll stay," she said. "At least for tonight. At least until I figure out what to do next." Sua nodded and pushed open the front door. The interior was just as modest as the exterior, a single room with a small kitchenette, a worn couch that had seen better decades, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. The walls were bare except for a few faded photographs and a calendar from 3 years ago. The floor was linoleum, cracked and stained. The ceiling had water damage in one corner. But it was spotless. Every surface gleamed with the careful attention of someone who had learned to take pride in the little they had. The sink was empty, the counters were wiped, and the single window was so clean it was almost invisible. Yuna set her bag down and looked around. "Where will you sleep?" "The couch," Sua said, gesturing to the worn piece of furniture. "That's not fair. I can't take your bed." Sua shrugged. "I've slept in worse places. I've slept on benches, in alleys, under bridges. The couch is luxury compared to some places I've crashed. You take the bed. You need your rest." It was such a simple gesture, and yet it made Yuna's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered her something without expecting anything in return. She couldn't remember the last time someone had put her needs before their own. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked. "I'm a stranger. I could be dangerous. I could be." Sua laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound, but there was warmth underneath it. "You're an Omega who was just sold by her family for $100. You have a bag that looks like it contains everything you own in the world. And you're standing in my house, looking like you haven't had a good meal in weeks. I think I can take my chances." Yuna felt heat rush to her cheeks. "That's not what I meant." "I know." Sua's eyes softened. "I'm nice because I remember what it was like to have nothing. To feel like no one wanted you. To wonder if you'd ever find a place where you belonged. To wonder if you'd ever find someone who saw you as more than just a designation." She paused, her voice dropping. "I spent a long time searching for that place. Maybe I found it. Maybe I didn't. But I know what it feels like to be lost, Yuna. And no one should have to face that alone." Something in Yuna's chest shifted. A warmth she hadn't felt in years, blooming like a flower in the dead of winter. It spread through her, filling the empty spaces that grief and loneliness had carved out. She looked at Sua, really looked at her, and noticed for the first time that beneath the grime and exhaustion, there was something beautiful about this woman. Something strong and steady and quiet. Something that made Yuna feel safe for the first time in years. "Thank you," Yuna whispered. "I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." Sua just nodded. "Get some rest. I'll make us something to eat." And as Yuna lay down on the narrow bed that night, listening to the sound of Sua moving around the kitchenette, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The days that followed were unlike anything Yuna had ever experienced. Life in Sua's little house was simple. There was no grand dining room, no marble floors, no staff to order around. Just a tiny kitchen, a worn couch, and 2 women learning to share space. There were no expensive clothes, no designer perfumes, no lavish meals. Just second-hand everything and simple food and the quiet comfort of someone else's presence. But for the first time in years, it was peaceful. Sua never demanded anything from her. She never reminded Yuna that she'd been bought, never treated her like a servant, never once tried to use her alpha status to control her. Instead, she asked what Yuna wanted for breakfast. She saved the warmest blanket for her. She made sure the house was clean and quiet, a sanctuary from the chaos Yuna had left behind. The first week was awkward. Yuna kept her distance, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was waiting for Sua to reveal her true colors, to show the cruelty that all alphas seemed to have buried inside them. She was waiting for the moment when Sua would demand something in return for her kindness, when the price of her shelter would finally become clear. But it never did. Sua was simply kind. Consistent. Reliable. Day after day, she proved herself to be exactly who she appeared to be. And Yuna began to see her differently. She noticed the way Sua's eyes crinkled when she smiled. The way her hands moved with precise, careful grace when she cooked. The way she hummed soft melodies under her breath when she thought no one was listening. The way she looked at Yuna when she thought Yuna wasn't looking, like she was something precious. She noticed the way Sua's alpha pheromones, faint and controlled, sometimes spiked with warmth when Yuna was nearby. The way Sua's scent would shift from neutral to something almost sweet when Yuna entered the room. The way her eyes would linger just a second longer than necessary. And Yuna began to wonder. She began to wonder about the stories Sua told in the evenings, about the dreams she'd given up and the ones she was still chasing. She began to wonder about the scars on Sua's hands, the ones that looked like they came from hard labor and a life that hadn't been easy. She began to wonder about the way Sua's voice softened when she talked about things that mattered to her. And she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was falling in love. One evening, a month into their arrangement, Yuna found herself sitting on the tiny porch, watching the sun set over the rooftops. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the clouds wispy and thin. It was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she'd seen in the mansion's manicured gardens. Sua joined her, settling onto the worn wooden step with a soft sigh. She was close enough that Yuna could feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough that she could smell the subtle undertones of her alpha scent. "Are you happy here?" Sua asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Yuna considered the question. She'd been asked that before, by people who didn't really care about the answer. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like Sua actually wanted to know. "I think." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think I'm starting to be. It's strange. I spent so long being miserable that I forgot what happiness felt like. I forgot what it felt like to wake up without dread. I forgot what it felt like to look forward to something." Sua nodded. "That's good. You deserve to be happy, Yuna. Even after everything that happened? Especially after everything that happened." Sua turned to look at her, and in the golden light of sunset, she looked like something out of a dream. The shadows under her eyes were still there, but they seemed softer now, less harsh. "You survived. That takes strength. You're still here. That takes courage. And you're still kind. That." She paused. "That takes everything." Yuna felt her heart flutter. "You think I'm kind? I think you're the kindest person I've ever met." Sua's voice was barely above a whisper. "Despite everything they did to you, you never stopped caring. You never stopped hoping. You never stopped being gentle, even when the world was cruel to you. That's rare, Yuna. That's beautiful." The words hit Yuna like a wave, warm and overwhelming. She felt tears pricking at her eyes, and she wasn't sure why. Maybe because no one had ever spoken to her like that. Maybe because she'd spent so long believing she was worthless that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "Thank you," she whispered. "For saying that." Sua reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. Yuna's omega instincts surged with sudden, fierce warmth. Sua's touch was gentle, her calloused fingers wrapping around Yuna's with a tenderness that made her heart ache. There was no force in it, no dominance, no demand. Just two people holding hands in the fading light. I mean it, Sua said. I've met a lot of people in my life, Yuna. And I've never met anyone like you. Yuna looked at their joined hands, then at Sua's face. There was something in those dark eyes, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Can I ask you something? Yuna said. Anything. Why did you really buy me? The question had been burning in her mind for weeks, and she couldn't hold it in any longer. I've been thinking about it. And I can't figure it out. There had to be other ways to help me. You could have given me money. You could have called the authorities. You could have done so many things that didn't involve spending everything you had. So why me? Sua was quiet for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the city. Finally, she sighed, running her free hand through her tangled hair. Because when I saw you, I saw myself, she said. 12 years ago, I was just like you. Alone. Desperate. Trapped by people who were supposed to love me. Her voice grew rough, thick with emotion. I got out. But I had help. Someone gave me a chance when I had nothing. Someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And I promised myself I would do the same for someone else someday. Yuna felt tears slide down her cheeks. Who helped you? My mentor. An older alpha who took me in when I had nowhere to go. She gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to keep going. She taught me that I was worth more than the people who had thrown me away. She taught me that I could be strong. Sua's eyes were distant, lost in memory. I owe everything to her. And when I saw you standing in that mansion, so brave even though you were terrified, I knew I had to help you. Even if it cost me everything I had. Yuna's chest ached with the sheer weight of those words. Sua had given up her last $100 for a stranger. She had opened her home, her life, her heart to someone she didn't even know. She had made a promise to a mentor she'd lost, and she was keeping it. Why? Yuna breathed. Why would you risk everything for me? Sua turned to face her fully, her alpha presence suddenly fierce and focused. Her scent shifted, growing stronger, more intense. Because, she said, her voice low, you're worth it. You're worth every penny. You're worth every sacrifice. You're worth everything I have and more. And I would do it all over again, 100 times over, just to see you smile. And then she kissed her. The kiss was soft, tentative, like Sua was afraid of breaking something precious. But there was passion underneath it, a fire that had been smoldering for weeks and was finally burning free. Yuna's omega instincts surged with overwhelming warmth, and she melted into the touch, her hands coming up to cup Sua's face. It was the first time she'd been kissed like she mattered. The first time she'd felt truly wanted. The first time she'd felt like more than just an omega to be controlled. When they finally broke apart, Sua's eyes were dark with emotion. Her cheeks were flushed, her breath coming in short gasps. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I shouldn't have done that without asking. You're vulnerable, and I'm... Yuna silenced her with another kiss, deeper this time. Don't apologize, she whispered against Sua's lips. Please don't apologize. I wanted this. I've wanted this for weeks. Sua's hands cradled her face, and Yuna felt the alpha's pheromones wrap around her like a warm blanket. It was different from the aggressive, dominating sense she'd grown up with. This was gentle. Protective. The scent of someone who wanted to keep her safe. I don't know what this is, Sua admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know what I'm feeling. But I know that I can't stop thinking about you. I know that every time you smile, it makes my entire day better. I know that I would do anything to protect you. Yuna's heart soared. I feel the same way, she confessed. I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. But I've never met anyone like you, Sua. You make me feel like I'm worth something. You are worth everything, Sua said fiercely. Don't ever let anyone make you believe otherwise. You are worth more than every dollar in every bank account in this city. You are worth more than all the money in the world. They sat on that porch until the stars came out, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Yuna learned about Sua's past, her difficult childhood, her escape from an abusive family, her years of struggle, her rise from nothing. She learned about the dreams Sua had given up and the ones she was still chasing. She learned about the loneliness that had driven her to the streets and the hope that had kept her going. And Sua learned about Yuna's grief, her loss, her fight to keep going despite everything. She learned about Yuna's father and the love they'd shared. She learned about Myri's cruelty and Soo-young's malice. She learned about the scars that Yuna carried inside, the ones that no one else could see. By the time they went to bed, Yuna felt like she'd known Sua her whole life. Weeks turned into months, and their bond deepened. Yuna found a small job at a cafe near the house. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover her own expenses, but it gave her independence, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her father died. She would return home each evening to find Sua waiting for her with dinner and a warm smile and the quiet comfort of someone who genuinely cared. They fell into a routine. Mornings were for coffee and conversation. Afternoons were for work and the small errands of daily life. Evenings were for sharing meals and stories and dreams. And nights were for lying in each other's arms, feeling the steady rhythm of each other's breathing, knowing that they weren't alone anymore. Yuna started to heal. The wounds that Myri and Soo-young had inflicted began to scar over. The sharp edges of her grief began to soften. The fear that had followed her everywhere began to fade. But there were still questions. Sometimes, when they were in public, strangers would do a double take when they saw Sua. They'd whisper behind their hands, point with barely concealed recognition. But before anyone could approach, Sua would calmly lead Yuna away, her expression carefully neutral. The first time it happened, Yuna asked about it. They've mistaken me for someone else, Sua said with a shrug. It happens sometimes. I have one of those faces. Yuna smiled, but she didn't believe her. There was something Sua wasn't telling her. Something about the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way she seemed to command attention even in her ragged clothes. Something about the way she sometimes stared at the distant skyscrapers with a look of longing. Not for the wealth they represented, but for something else. Something Yuna couldn't quite identify. But Yuna didn't push. She trusted Sua. And she knew that when the time was right, Sua would tell her everything. And then, one afternoon, everything changed. Sua's phone rang. It was an old, battered device, held together with tape, but the moment she looked at the screen, her entire demeanor shifted. The calm, steady alpha Yuna had grown to love disappeared, replaced by something sharp and alert. Her posture straightened. Her eyes narrowed. Her scent shifted to something intense and focused. I need to step outside, Sua said, her voice clipped. Stay here. Don't leave the house. She didn't wait for an answer. She was gone before Yuna could ask what was wrong. Sua didn't return that night. Or the next. Or the one after that? Yuna's worry grew with every passing hour. She called Sua's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She searched the house for clues, but found nothing except a scrap of paper with a phone number written on it, the number that had called Sua that afternoon. With trembling fingers, Yuna dialed. "Hello," a calm voice answered. "Who is this?" I'm looking for Kong Sua." This was the number that called her a few days ago. "I'm her," Yuna paused. What was she to Sua? Friend? Lover? Something in between? "I'm her roommate. She hasn't come home, and I'm worried." "Is she okay? What happened to her?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice said, "Ms. Kong is currently occupied. She's in a meeting. But if you'd like to see her, I can give you an address." Yuna wrote down the address and took the next bus to Gangnam. She expected a small office or an apartment building. Instead, she found herself standing in front of a towering corporate headquarters, all glass and steel and gleaming lights. The building rose 50 stories into the sky, dominating the skyline. Luxury cars lined the entrance, and executives in expensive suits hurried through the revolving doors. Yuna's Omega instinct screamed at her to turn around. This was not her world. She didn't belong here. She was a servant, a nobody, an Omega who had been sold for $100. She had no right to be here. But Sua was here. And she had to find her. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was enormous, all marble and chrome, with a massive logo on the far wall, CHA Group. The letters were gold, gleaming under the bright lights. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting rainbows across the polished floor. Yuna stared at the logo. Cha was her father's surname. Her surname. But her father's company had been dismantled years ago, sold off to competitors after his death. What was Cha Group doing here? And why did it feel so familiar? Before she could think further, the lobby erupted into chaos. Every employee in sight suddenly straightened, lowering their heads in unison. A hush fell over the space, broken only by the murmur of respectful greetings. "Welcome back, Chairwoman Kang." Yuna turned toward the entrance. A black luxury sedan had pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. Gone were the worn clothes and weathered boots. In their place was a perfectly tailored black suit, sleek and expensive. Her hair was neatly tied back, revealing a face that was sharp, powerful, and utterly commanding. Her alpha presence filled the lobby, dominating every scent in the room. She moved with the grace of someone who owned the world. It was Sua. But not the Sua Yuna knew. This was Chairwoman Kang Sua, the richest, most powerful alpha CEO in all of South Korea. The woman who had built an empire from nothing. The woman whose name was whispered in boardrooms and celebrated in magazines. The woman who could buy and sell the entire city with her pocket change. Yuna's legs gave out. She collapsed onto a nearby bench, her mind reeling. Everything she believed about Sua had been turned upside down. The homeless alpha she'd fallen in love with was actually the head of a billion-dollar empire. The woman who'd bought her for $100 could buy the entire country if she wanted to. The woman who slept on a worn couch and cooked simple meals had a mansion somewhere that Yuna had never seen. Sua strode through the lobby, her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't see Yuna. But Yuna saw her. She saw the confidence in Sua's stride, the authority in her posture, the way everyone around her practically bowed in reverence. This was a woman who commanded respect. A woman who had built an empire from nothing. A woman who had clawed her way to the top and stayed there through sheer determination. And yet, she had slept on a worn couch to give Yuna the bed. She had cooked simple meals with her own hands. She had smiled at Yuna like she was the most precious thing in the world. She had kissed Yuna like she was the only thing that mattered. Who was the real Sua? Yuna didn't have to wait long for an answer. Hours later, Sua found her in the lobby. She was still in her suit, but her expression had softened the moment she saw Yuna. The fierce, commanding alpha had disappeared, replaced by the gentle woman Yuna had fallen in love with. Yuna. Her voice was gentle, the way it always was when she spoke to her. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I was going to tell you. I just needed to find the right moment. Yuna looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. Who are you? She whispered. Who are you really? Sua knelt in front of her, her alpha presence warm and soothing. I'm the woman who fell in love with you, she said simply. I'm the woman who would give up everything just to see you smile. I'm the woman who bought you for $100 because I saw the light in your eyes and knew I couldn't let it die. I'm the woman who would sell every share I own, every asset I have, every possession I've ever accumulated, just to hold your hand one more time. But you're rich. You're powerful. You could have anything you wanted. Why would you pretend to be homeless? Why would you sleep on streets and eat scraps and let people look down on you? Sua reached out and took Yuna's hand. Because for years, people only saw my money. They wanted my name, my influence, what I could give them. I couldn't tell who cared about me and who cared about my wealth. So I walked away. I left behind the mansion, the cars, the life everyone envied. I wanted to find someone who would see me, the real me, before anything else. She cupped Yuna's face gently. And then I found you. You never knew I was Chairwoman Kong. You only knew Sua. The woman who shared a meal with you. The woman who held your hand on the porch. The woman who kissed you under the stars. The woman you chose before you knew what I owned. Yuna's tears fell harder. I don't care about your money, she choked out. I never cared. I just wanted you. I just wanted someone who would see me. Someone who would love me. I don't care about your wealth or your power or your title. I just want you. I know. Sua's eyes shone with unshed tears. That's why I love you, Yuna. Because you love the woman, not the title. You love the person I am, not what I can give you. You love me for me. And that's all I've ever wanted. Yuna threw her arms around Sua, holding her tight. I love you, she whispered. I love you so much it scares me. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. Sua held her just as tightly. I love you too. And I'm never letting you go. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care what anyone thinks. I love you, and that's all that matters. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the middle of the bustling lobby. People walked around them, but Yuna didn't care. She didn't care about the stares or the whispers. She only cared about the woman in her arms. When they finally pulled apart, Sua smiled. I have something to tell you, she said. Something I should have told you a long time ago. Yuna wiped her tears. What? I bought Cha Group. Your father's company. I bought it 3 years ago, right after he died. I bought it from the people who tried to tear it apart. I bought it so I could give it back to you. Yuna's breath caught in her throat. What? I knew about you, Yuna. I knew what Myri was doing to you. I knew she'd stolen your inheritance. I knew she'd made you a servant in your own home. I wanted to help you, but I couldn't do it directly. So I bought the company. I hid my identity. And I waited. I watched. And when the opportunity came, I took it. I bought you from her. And I brought you home. Yuna stared at her, unable to process what she was hearing. You did all that for me? You bought a company for me? You pretended to be homeless for me? I would have done anything for you, Sua said simply. I would have torn down the entire world if it meant keeping you safe. I would have given up everything I had, everything I was, just to give you a chance. Because you deserve it. You deserve the world. Months passed, and Yuna's life transformed. She and Sua built a life together, one that balanced Sua's corporate empire with their quiet evenings in the little house. They kept the house as their sanctuary, a reminder of where they'd started and how far they'd come. They didn't move into the mansion. They didn't buy a penthouse. They stayed in the little house, because it was theirs, and it meant something. Yuna never wanted to return to the world of mansions and servants. She just wanted Sua. And Sua wanted her. They were married in a small ceremony, just the two of them and a handful of trusted friends. Yuna wore a simple white dress, and Sua wore a suit that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. They exchanged vows under the cherry blossom trees in the house's tiny courtyard. I promise to love you, Sua said, her voice steady. Not because you're an Omega, or because you're kind, or because you make my life better. I promise to love you because you're you. Because you're the woman who smiled at me when I had nothing. Because you're the woman who held my hand and didn't care about my wealth. Because you're the woman who made me believe that love was possible. And that's all I've ever needed. Yuna's heart swelled. I promise to love you, she echoed. Not because you're powerful, or because you saved me, or because you bought my father's company. I promise to love you because you see me. You see the woman I am, and you love her anyway. You see my scars and my fears and my flaws, and you love me anyway. You make me believe that I'm worth something. They kissed under a shower of pink petals, and Yuna knew she'd finally found her home. One evening, they attended the annual charity gala hosted by Cha Group. It was the first time Yuna had been seen in public as Sua's wife, and she was nervous. But Sua never let go of her hand. Cameras flashed as they walked the red carpet. Reporters called Sua's name from every direction. But through it all, Sua's eyes stayed fixed on Yuna. You're beautiful, Sua murmured. And you're mine. Yuna blushed. I'm always yours. The gala was a blur of champagne and polite conversation, but Yuna's attention never strayed from her wife. She watched Sua charm investors and executives with effortless grace, and she felt a surge of pride. This was her alpha. This was the woman who had saved her. And she would never forget it. Miles away, in the Han mansion, Myri and Su Young sat in their living room with the television playing in the background. Neither of them paid much attention until the presenter spoke. Chairwoman Kong Sua arrives tonight with her wife, Yuna Kong. Myri slowly looked up. Su Young turned toward the screen. The cameras settled on the couple, and for a moment, neither woman moved. There was Yuna. The Omega they'd sold for $100. The girl they'd thrown away like garbage. The servant who had scrubbed their floors and cooked their meals. Now standing beside one of the richest women in Korea as her wife. Myri's face went white. Su Young's jaw dropped. The room fell silent. Every cruel word, every insult, every decision they'd made came rushing back. Only now did they understand what they'd thrown away, not because they loved Yuna, but because their greed had cost them a future they could never get back. The morning after the gala, two unexpected visitors arrived at the Cha residence. Myri and Soo-young stepped out of a taxi, wearing warm smiles that had never existed before. They barely reached the front door before Yuna appeared. For a moment, no one spoke. Myri forced a smile. "Yuna, we've missed you. We've been so worried about you. We wanted to make sure you were okay." Soo-young nodded quickly. "We've been so worried. We watched the gala and couldn't believe our eyes. You look so beautiful. We're so proud of you." Yuna looked at them quietly. Not long ago, she would have believed every word. Not long ago, she would have been desperate for their approval. Not long ago, she would have let them back into her life, hoping that this time, they would treat her differently. But not anymore. "Goodbye," she said simply. "And don't come back." She turned and walked back through the gates without a backward glance. And Myri could only watch her go. The frightened Omega she'd once controlled was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth. A woman who had found love and respect in family. And she realized, too late, that some things, some people, were more valuable than money. A second chance. A family. A love that didn't come with conditions. She had sold all of that for $100. And she would never get it back. Years later, Yuna sat on the porch of the little house with her wife, watching the sun set over Seoul. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up everything? The mansion, the cars, the luxury?" Sua laughed softly. "I didn't give up anything worth keeping. I found the only thing that matters." She squeezed Yuna's hand. "I found you." Yuna leaned against her shoulder, content. The girl who had once been sold for $100 had found something far more valuable than money. She had found a place where she was loved, respected, treated as family. And she had found the alpha who saw her, not as an omega to be controlled, but as a person to be cherished. Sometimes, the people who tried to throw your life away unknowingly led you to the life you were always meant to find. And sometimes, the greatest fortune wasn't wealth or power. It was the heart that chose you when there was nothing to gain. The heart that loved you anyway. And the hands that held you through every storm. Yuna looked at her wife and smiled. She was home.